All right, let's take a little refresher here. This is something we went over on Monday and Tuesday, but I want to take a moment to refresh our memory here and talk about McCloud's Chapter 4 from Understanding Comics. This chapter is referred to as time frames. So McCloud opens this by talking about this idea of slowing it down. He says that when it comes to the movement of time inside comics, McCloud specifically notes that it is infinitely weirder than simply slowing down or freezing time itself. In other words, what we're dealing here with is the idea that he's trying to mention or make note that it's not simply a matter like a simple movie strip where we can slow it down. There's a little bit more complexity. And he says here that panels themselves can be open to and involved in the movement of time. Now, if we think back real quickly here before I move on to the next slide, in Chapter 3, we talked about the use of the gutter as a way for moving time between those panels, such as that example of the guy about to swing an axe and the other guy yelling "yo no," and then we cut to a scene outside. That was a space movement of time. But now we're going to talk more about how this is a little bit more complex than simply moving panel to panel. Here's an example of a one panel, and it asks the question, is this a single moment? So let's start on the left hand side, because if we were going to approach this panel, we're going to approach it just like we're reading a book. We're going to start on the left hand side and move right, and we'll move left to right, up, down. So look here, there's a man with a camera, smile, "Ugh, that flash is blinding, Uncle Henry." And the girl, "Hee hee. Oh, Henry, put that camera away, will you?" "Ah, let him be, Mom. He's just having fun." "Well, if old Henry is going to have much more fun, we may have to lock him in the wine cellar." "Check." "Hmm. Sure you want to make that move, Jed? That move there, Jed?" Now, you're probably guessed by this point, this is not a single moment, and really this scene over here on the left-hand side really is the dead hit giveaway that sort of helps you understand this right at the bat. So, of course, McCloud, reinforces the idea this is hardly the same time. He says, even the brief sound of the flashbulb has a certain duration, short to be sure, but not instantaneous. Far slower is the duration of the average word. Uncle Henry alone burns up a good second in this panel, especially since smile undoubtedly preceded the flash. Likewise, the next balloons would have only followed the burst of the light bulb. So really, within that small section right there, we're dealing with what could be broken down to three separate panels. There's obviously a movement of time. Now, granted, it may be only a second, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 5 seconds, but there has been some movement. And here's another example of what helps us determine that movement, ideally, is the passage of words and sounds. It says here, just as pictures and intervals between them create the illusion of time through closure, words introduce time by representing that which can only exist in time, sound. Okay? So if you want to imagine the clock here, this could be something of a second hand moving. So you can move from left to right, and then obviously the woman in the middle was commenting on what he just did. The girl's responding to the mother's first comment here in the middle. And then over here on the far right, these two guys are commenting on the original sequence. One guy mentioning about apparently Uncle Henry back where there was a bit of a drinker, and then reflecting he drops in the word check, and they're playing chess. So this man says, "Are you sure about that move?" So all of this could take a matter of seconds. Maybe I would say somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds. Okay? And then, of course, McCloud's estimation is about a half minute or so. So 20, 30 seconds probably. And he then goes on to mention here this idea that perhaps we've been too conditioned by photography to perceive single images as single moments. After all, it does take the eye time to move across a scene, the scenes in real life. So even your motion of your own eye looking at this takes time. Each figure is arranged from left to right in the sequence we will read them, each occupying a distinct time slot. So we return to that image again, except this time we've inserted the gutters to sort of help clarify the sequence spatially, with time here. In some respects, he says here, this panel by itself actually fits our definition of comics. All it needs is a few gutters thrown in to clarify the sequence. So, of course, smile, gutter, then the people responding to the flash, then the woman responding to her husband and her daughter, and then somebody else talking about that, having the moment with check. So one panel in this example here is operating as several panels, really. Okay. But of course, McCloud goes on here to point out that panels act as a sort of general indicator of time and space, or space is being, or that time or space is being divided. The durations of that time and the dimensions of that space are defined more by the contents of the panel than by the panel itself. So example here, we see a man with a ball dribbling, then he's giving it his all, and then he's giving it all that when all these, the narration, the added narration, and then the added voice of an announcer help change the distinction of how much time is passing. Now, of course, panels themselves do take different shapes, and they can vary considerably depending on how the artist or the depiction. Differences in shape, though, don't affect the specific meanings of the panels, but they can affect how we read and the experience of them. Okay. Now, he talks about this strange relationship between time as depicted in comics and time perceived by the reader. And he particularly notes that when we learn to read comics, the audience or reader is in fact asked to perceive time spatially. For in the world of comics, time and space are one and the same. So keep that in mind. Time and space are one and the same. Let me return here to this very first panel. If time and space are the same, notice how this panel is elongated. It's, in a sense, stretching of the panel is a stretching of time. So that allows us to move from left to right and then see the panel in that way, only because it exists in this kind of form. So the elongated panel or the cut up panel, either way, helps elaborate this passage of time. In other words, time passes not only as we move left to right, up and down, panel by panel, but it can pass even as we simply move left to right, even within a panel, as we just looked at with that one that McCloud helped deconstruct for us. So here's an example. So as readers, we are left only with a vague sense, though, oftentimes, of how much time has passed. We sort of have to guesstimate it. But that as our eyes are moving through space, they're also moving through time. We just don't know how much. And so here's an example of a sequencing of images. And of course, the man on the far left says, "I always figured Mary Ann would go for Gilligan." Then we see another man's face, and then him saying, "I guess." The question I would ask you here is, how much time do you think has passed? Perhaps in my mind, I like to imagine that perhaps the man on the left speaks, we cut over to the other guy, so maybe a second, and then he responds. So very small delay. And this is would be what we, as McCloud here is, this would be similar, something we'd be familiar with. An educated guess, duration of time, as long as the elements of that sequence are familiar to us, all right? From a lifetime of conversations, we can be sure that the pause in the panel is lasts no more than several seconds. But here in this next sequence, the creator of this scene wanted to lengthen the pause. So he chooses to lengthen the pause by inserting more panels. Okay, so same question, well, it's a different question here. It says, do you think the Sox could finally do it this year? Then the man, pause, pause, pause. I guess. Now, in this situation, the extra panels in between of him doing nothing leaves the impression that maybe he had nodded off or he's not paying attention. And so, obviously, with the eyes looking like they're almost closed, it gives you the impression he probably waited or wasn't paying attention. And so, it took him longer to respond. But here's another way. That's not the only way to do this. Is there any way to make a single silent panel like the one seem longer? And in this example here, and let's go back real quickly, notice this exact sequence here. Notice the difference between the panels. If you look closely at this one, we have elongated the gutter space in an attempt to emphasize a longer passage of time. Okay, so not only could we insert more panels, but we could elongate the gutter space. So, and then McCloud wraps up here with saying, we've seen how time can be controlled through the content of panels and the number of panels and the closure between the panel. But there's one more, he points out. And here's the third one. Okay, and this one connects sort of back, the third or fourth one, connects back to that elongated panel we looked at the beginning. Okay, and in this case, what we've done here is we've stretched the panel itself in an attempt to also represent a feeling of greater length and time. All right. And so, of course, McCloud comes back to this idea in comics, as in film, television, in real life, it is always now. Okay, so he's talking about the present time. This panel, the one he's talking about in the middle, is this panel alone represents the present. Any panel before it, the last one, for instance, represents the past. Likewise, all panels still to come, this next panel, for instance, represent the future. But unlike other media in comics, the past is more than just memories for the audience, and the future is more than just possibilities. And this is a lovely hypergraphical images, complex one here. Comic readers are also conditioned by other medias and by the real time of everyday life to expect a very linear progression, just a straight line from point A to B. But is that necessary? And one of the things we're going to get into is how we can complicate this aspect a little bit more. So we're going to start with this sort of linear progression we've been working with, but we're going to advance it a little bit from here. So, of course, I would ask you if there are any questions, but also I'd like you to go ahead and try practicing this. So, taking a fresh sheet of paper, I want you to simply tell a story of the passing of time. Choose any method you want. You could go back and simply have a very short progression of time, where there was just that one pause like we saw the first time. Perhaps you would want to do the other one where there is a elongated series of panels. There's a series of panels that represent the motion of time. Maybe you elongate the gutter space. Maybe you elongate the panel itself. Okay, but all of these I want you to do is practice that demonstration of time, and we'll work from there.